He conquered the known world. But what if the legacy he left was never truly his? Welcome to Echo Slumber. I am your host, Arlen Graves. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your thoughts make these ancient stories feel brand new. Let's begin. He marched across the known world, draped in lion skins and myth, carving a path from Macedonia to the edge of the unknown. To many, Alexander was a blazing comet of conquest, a golden legend whispered in marble halls. But what if the tale we've been told isn't the full story? What if his empire left behind more questions than triumphs? Beneath the medals and the marble, there are silences, footprints that vanish at the river's edge. And perhaps, just perhaps, his true legacy was not what he conquered, but what he tried to erase. Tonight, let us follow that fading trail, across sunlit ruins, broken scrolls, and echoes in desert wind. We truly love and care for you, dear listener. Your presence means the world, and you're never alone here. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. He was not born beneath the stars, he was born reaching toward them. In the palace at Pella, where the columns cast long morning shadows and the servants whispered of omens, a boy listened more closely to stories than to sleep. They said his mother slept with serpents. They said his father carried thunder in his walk. They said he would rule the world. But Alexander, not yet called great, believed none of that was enough. He wanted to be more than a name carved into a wall. He wanted to live like the stories carved into time. From the moment he could hold a wooden sword, he was reenacting Homer, not as performance, but as prophecy. He wasn't just playing Achilles, he was Achilles, and he needed the world to believe it too. His mother Olympias was the first to encourage this. She did not speak to him of farms or taxes. She told him he had been sired by Zeus. She brushed his hair like it was a crown. She let him feed the sacred snakes in her chamber, whispering that gods do not fear their own creatures. But it was Aristotle who gave him the firewood. Alexander asked questions like he was trying to tear open the sky. Why are men ruled? What is death? What lies beyond the Indus? And why do some names last longer than the stones they're carved into? Aristotle answered with scrolls and certainty. But the boy wanted more than answers. He wanted meaning. Alexander studied geometry and medicine, ethics and logic, but always his eyes drifted back to the epics. The Iliad was not just a text, it was scripture. It was map and mirror. And somewhere in his marrow he believed to live a quiet life was to waste it. To die young, carved in song, that was the real immortality. At 12, he tamed the horse no man could. Bucephalus, wide-eyed and wild, afraid of his own shadow, Alexander saw not fear, but misunderstanding. He turned the horse toward the sun so no shadow could fall across its path. It was a moment the bards would later sing, but to the boy it meant something deeper. Even beasts need someone who sees beyond the fear. His father Philip was impressed, but also troubled. A boy with that kind of vision could not be contained. Even kings fear sons who dream too loudly. And dream he did. He imagined armies like symphonies, cities with his name, a world with one language, one law, one legend, his. But before the conquest, before the crown, there was a boy sitting under a fig tree, reading Homer aloud to no one but the wind. His voice soft, his eyes bright, his heart already writing chapters no one had asked for. He did not want to be good. He wanted to be remembered. That is how it begins, not with a sword, not with a map, but with a page. A boy stares at legend until he believes he is one. And slowly, the world begins to bend to that belief. Let us rest now with that image. A boy beneath the stars, plotting a path to them, before the battles, before the burnings, when history was still a dream in the hands of a child. Close your eyes. The wind still carries whispers from Pella. And somewhere, a boy still stares at legends, daring them to blink first. He was born between a sword and a spell. Philip II of Macedon ruled with the logic of siege engines and the momentum of cavalry. His eyes measured cities, not suns. He unified Greece not through charm, but through calculation, with alliances stitched like armour and enemies buried like failed crops. He built walls and tore down borders. He planned, and always he moved ahead of the next man's thought. Olympias, by contrast, lived in the invisible. She whispered to gods in the dark and anointed her son's feet with oil and myth. Her love was not soft, it was molten, possessive, divine. Together, they were storm and steel, and the boy who grew in their wake was never allowed stillness. Alexander's childhood was a war not of weapons, but of worlds. Philip would mock Olympia's mysticism. Olympias would poison the boy's ear with rumours that his father was not his father. She spoke often of Zeus, of lightning, of serpents curled at her ankles in sleep, and she said it with such unwavering gaze, such ritual intensity, that the boy, half believer, half survivor, began to believe. He learned early that truth was not always what was real. It was what was repeated, shaped, burned into the mind until it became armour. Philip, for all his ambition, saw his son as both heir and rival. Alexander had the favour of the people. He had the gift of language. Where Philip conquered with plans, Alexander enchanted with presence. Crowds leaned in when he spoke. Soldiers watched him like he was already history. And so, their love turned cautious, then brittle. They admired one another from a distance, too wide to cross. One night, when Alexander was still a teenager, Philip married a new wife, a Macedonian girl, young and fertile. At the wedding banquet, the girl's uncle raised a toast. May the union produce a legitimate heir. Alexander, seated beside his mother, stood up. He threw wine in the man's face, accused him of treason. Philip, already drunk, rose with his sword in hand and stumbled toward his son. He fell before he could raise it. Alexander's words, cool and sharp, pierced deeper than any blade. Here is the man preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross the room without falling. The court froze. That night, Alexander fled with Olympias. For months, they lived in tension, exiled but not forgotten, and then just as suddenly, they were summoned back. Philip had forgiven him, or pretended to, but behind every reconciliation, there was now a shadow, long, coiled and waiting. Then came the day of the wedding of Philip's daughter, Alexander's half-sister, a grand celebration, trumpets, guests, peacocks and dancers. And at the height of it all, as Philip walked into the theatre, unguarded and smiling, a man rushed forward and stabbed him through the ribs. Chaos, screaming. The killer cut down moments later, but the questions were louder than the cries. Why had Philip dismissed his bodyguards? Why had the killer been able to approach so easily? And who, truly, had given him cause? Olympias returned with eerie calm. She had the new queen's child torn from her arms and murdered. She had rival claimants executed. She placed her son on the throne, wrapped not in ceremony, but in control. Alexander, only 20, did not flinch. He rode into the chaos, declared himself king, and ordered the conspirators' names erased. He held his father's funeral with grandeur, a display of honour, but also dominance. But beneath the purple robes, beneath the proclamations, there was a wound. Whether he knew of the plot or not, whether he whispered it into motion or simply didn't stop it, the truth became irrelevant. What mattered was that he was now king, a king with ghosts behind him, a mother beside him, and a father beneath him. He never spoke of the murder again, but he kept Olympias close, too close, some said. She wrote him letters constantly, advising, warning, weaving new dangers out of thin air, and though he bristled, he listened, for in her voice he heard prophecy and paranoia. The court began to whisper that Alexander's crown was stained before it was polished, that the gods had not chosen him, only ambition had. But the world did not wait. There were rebellions to crush, generals to command, horizons to chase, and so the questions remained unanswered. Folded into scrolls, buried in silences, what remains is not proof but pattern. His reign began not with coronation, but with blood. Not with triumph, but with a void, shaped like a father. And as Alexander marched forward, he did so with a ghost at his heel and a mother whose fire would one day burn his house from within. But tonight, we leave that moment frozen. A boy turned king, standing over the shadow of the man he once feared. Storm and silence, steel and spell, sleep now, listener. The truth doesn't always speak this way, but it always waits. He did not see borders, he saw possibilities. Before Alexander held a sword or wore a crown, he held a map. Not one inked by geographers or sanctioned by courts, but one drawn in the silence of his boyhood room, over late nights and candle wax. It was not a map of land, but of desire, of whispers carried in trade caravans, of the strange, the unseen, the unnamed. To most men, the world ended at the edges of the Mediterranean. Beyond that, they marked dragons, sea monsters, and warnings. Here there be madness, here there be gods. But Alexander believed the world began at the edge. He would study scrolls with Aristotle, asking not what the world was, but what it could be. What river fed the Nile? What lay beyond the Hindu Kush? Did the ocean circle the earth or open into something more? He imagined not conquest, but completion. A world made whole by footsteps, a canvas filled in by presence. And so when the crown was his, he did not sit. He moved, north to crush rebellion, south to reaffirm dominion, but always east, always toward the sunrise, toward the edge. The campaign against Persia was not only revenge for Philip's wars, it was pilgrimage. He would walk where Achilles had walked. He would cross the Hellespont not as invader, but as descendant. He even paused to cast offerings into the sea, as if asking permission. At Troy, he knelt by what was said to be Achilles' tomb. He took a shield from the temple and wept. Some say it was grief, some say it was theatre, but in his face there was a boy still chasing stories, trying to stitch the mythic into the real. As his army advanced, the lines on existing maps began to blur. He redrew them with motion. The cities he captured were not just spoils, they were coordinates in his imagined world. He renamed them. Alexandria in Egypt, Alexandria in Aria, Alexandria near the Indus, each one a pin on the parchment of his longing. But he was not trying to own the world. He was trying to reach it. His pace became relentless. Even his generals began to whisper, "Why not rest? Why not rule?" But rest was for those with endings in mind. Alexander believed geography was incomplete, and he, perhaps, had been born to finish it. When he reached the deserts of Central Asia and then the lush strangeness of India, even his cartographers stopped understanding. The stars shifted, the rivers reversed, but still, he pressed forward. He ordered scouts to write what they saw. He commissioned men to take samples of soil, plants, birdsong. The world, to him, was a living manuscript, waiting to be read, annotated, understood. But here, the dream grew heavier. The deeper into the unknown he went, the more resistant the land became. Monsoons drowned the road, elephants crushed men like brittle clay. The jungles refused to echo orders. And yet, he would not turn back. Not until he reached what he called the edge of the world. Not until his feet touched the final wave. In his private writings, now lost, it is said he described a vision, a shore so quiet it felt outside of time, a place where the sun slept, where he could finally say, "Now I know." But the edge was always receding, and the map in his mind was not a scroll, but a horizon. It bent with the wind. It stretched with wonder. It could not be conquered, only followed. When his men refused to march further, Near the Ephesus river, he stood before them in silence. Then he wept. Not because he had failed, but because the world had run out of room. He built altars at the riverbank and turned around. Not toward defeat, but toward reflection. He had touched what no Macedonian ever had. He had threaded roads into silence. And though the map was still unfinished, he had traced enough of it to remind the world that the unknown was not to be feared, but to be approached. Tonight, let us fold that map again. Let us smooth its corners and place it beside us as we drift to sleep. For the dream of the world, its rivers, its ridges, its distant light, was once held in the mind of a young king who believed that walking to the edge of the world was the same as walking into eternity. Close your eyes now. Let your breath follow the line of his imagined road and see where it leads next. The desert does not speak in words, it breathes, it waits, and somewhere in the breath between dunes, in the hush between sky and sand, stood the Siwa oasis, quiet, golden, and watching. It was not easy to reach. Alexander had to cross a stretch of emptiness the locals called the Road of Bones. Men died there, horses collapsed, water vanished, yet he pressed on, driven not by strategy, but by a question. He wanted to ask the gods who he truly was, not as king, not as son of Philip, but as something more. The temple of Amun at Siwa was not built for crowds. It was not adorned like Delphi or whispered of in Athens, but it was ancient, older than the war gods, older than even the stories that survived. It sat half buried in silence, a place where oracles didn't predict the future. They confirmed the unspoken. Alexander arrived worn and dusted, his eyes darker now than the boy who once studied under Aristotle. He entered the temple alone, no generals, no scribes, only sand trailing behind him like a second shadow. What happened inside has never been agreed upon. Some say the oracle greeted him with, "O, son of Zeus." Others say it gave no answer at all. Some whispered that Alexander misheard the priest, a slip of tongue between Paidios, child, and Paidios, child of God. But in the end, it didn't matter what was spoken. He emerged changed, not triumphant, but still like a man who had finally convinced himself of something he'd long suspected. He told no one the exact words. He offered sacrifices to Amun. He wept quietly at the edge of the spring. And when his men asked what the oracle had said, he smiled and said, "You will know in time." From that day, he encouraged his followers to think of him as divine, not merely a king, but a bridge between gods and mortals. He allowed coins to be minted with his likeness in radiant crown. He sat alone at councils, untouchable. He no longer rode at the centre of formation, but ahead as if walking beside something invisible. It was not arrogance, it was certainty. A soft, strange certainty that unnerved even those who loved him. He had not heard the oracle, he had become its answer. But belief once spoken demands to be protected. Those who doubted, those who joked, who questioned, who muttered, began to vanish from his circle. Not publicly, not violently, just gradually erased. Even Aristotle, once his mentor, was kept at a growing distance. The philosopher dealt in questions. Alexander no longer needed questions. He had confirmation. And confirmation, when unshaken, becomes a kind of silence. When he entered Egypt not long after, the people welcomed him as a liberator and a god. He ordered the construction of Alexandria on the coast, but his heart remained inland, in the hush of Siwa. Some nights his tent remained lit until morning. His generals believed he was reading dispatches, but some say he was simply sitting in the dark, listening to the silence speak back. The belief in his divinity became not just personal, but political. If he was divine, then rebellion was not just treason, it was blasphemy. If he was a god, then death in his name meant eternal reward. It changed the language of war. It softened the sting of sacrifice, but it also began to isolate him. When a man believes he is chosen, he begins to drift from those who are not. And slowly, His steps grew heavier, his eyes more distant, as if he no longer walked on the same ground as other men. Still, the question lingers, like heat rising off desert stone. What did the oracle really say? Was it a word, a whisper, a trick of translation? Or was it silence, that most dangerous of affirmations, where nothing is said and everything is believed? We may never know, but we can picture the moment. A man kneels in the heart of a forgotten temple, his breath echoing against walls carved in ancient light. He is asking not for power, but for permission, and whatever came next, he carried it with him until the end. Tonight, let us close our eyes and return there, not to the battlefields, not to the burning cities, but to that temple in the sand, where belief was born or revealed or imagined, and where silence once again proved more powerful than words. Sleep now. The desert still listens. He dreamed in stone. Wherever Alexander paused, between battles, beneath, new constellations, at the edges of rivers whose names he couldn't pronounce, he built. Cities rose like thoughts made visible. Square grids, wide boulevards, temples, markets, garrisons, walls, and always he gave them the same name, Alexandria. More than 70 times. He scattered them across the known and half-known world, like lanterns tossed into the dark. But many of those cities, those Alexandrias, are gone now, faded, overgrown, forgotten, as if the earth never agreed to remember them. Why did he build so many, and why did so few remain? Some say it was strategy. He needed supply chains, garrisons, loyal populations on foreign soil. Cities made the empire breathable. They tethered conquest to continuity. Others say it was legacy. A man who raced death needed to leave footprints deep enough to survive it. But perhaps it was something quieter. Perhaps he was trying to draw himself into the landscape, as if every valley, every plain might remember him differently if it bore his name. Each Alexandria followed a pattern, a standard layout based on Greek models, rational, geometric, ideal, the theatre in the centre, the agora nearby, each one a mirror of the world he thought he understood. But what he didn't always understand was the world that came before him. Many of these cities were built over older settlements, tribal lands, river kingdoms, sacred hills. He overlaid them with his own order, but order without listening rarely holds. To the locals, Alexandria was not home. It was a mask, built too fast, spoken in a foreign tongue. Some stayed out of necessity, most simply left. The desert winds returned. The jungle crept in. Walls cracked, roads disappeared beneath roots, and time with its soft erasures did what no army could. It reclaimed. There are Alexandrias we cannot even locate today. Their coordinates lost, their stones repurposed, their names remembered only because he insisted we repeat them. But there was one city that did survive, not just in name, but in breath. Alexandria in Egypt, built on the edge of the sea, founded with ceremony and silence. Legend says he marked its borders with barley instead of stone. That when birds descended and ate the grain, his men panicked. But Alexander smiled. He saw it as a sign that his city would feed the world. Here, for once, his vision held. The harbour thrived. The lighthouse reached toward the sky like a second sun, and the library, though it came later, became the soul of the place. But even here, time whispered through the cracks. The original vision was altered, the plans changed hands, and Alexandria, the city, like the man, became mythic because the truth was harder to hold. The other cities, the ones with no lighthouse, no library, no poets, they were not nurtured, they were named and left. And names without roots wash away like chalk in the rain. Still, there's something strangely human in it, the need to name, to place ourselves on the map, not just as wanderers, but as architects of meaning. Alexander named cities for himself, not because he was vain, but because he was trying to stay. In every Alexandria, he tried to leave a version of himself behind. a shadow that could speak when his voice could no longer reach. But shadows are fragile, and stone, though hard, forgets. The people who lived in these cities did not remember Alexander as a god or even a king. They remembered taxes, language barriers, soldiers who didn't understand the land. They remembered being spoken over, not spoken to, so they walked away. And the cities, no matter how carefully planned, became bones. We visit some of them now in silence, just foundations, shards, an amphora buried in dust, others we cannot find at all. But if you listen closely, on quiet nights, under certain stars, you might still hear the echo of footsteps, the scratching of plans in sand, a man's voice repeating a name over and over, hoping it would last longer than breath. Let us rest here, in the ruins of a dream, not to mourn what faded, but to understand that some things are not meant to last. Some cities are built not for permanence, but for the brief glow of intention, and that glow, however fleeting, still warms the night. Sleep now, traveller. The wind is soft tonight over forgotten walls, and somewhere beneath the dust, a name is still waiting to be spoken one more time. Long before scrolls were copied, before shelves reached the ceiling and flame reached the shelves, Alexander dreamed of a library, not a building of silence and dust, but a living archive, a sanctuary of every language, every map, every medicine and myth, a place where the world, in all its contradiction and wonder, could be gathered and held. He imagined it not as possession, but as preservation, to collect what war tried to erase, to learn from those he conquered, rather than bury them beneath his name. It was, perhaps, his quietest dream. Before Alexandria was laid stone by stone on the Egyptian coast, before its harbour knew ships or scholars or secrets, he spoke of a place where scrolls from India, Babylon, Egypt, and Greece would sit side by side, like guests at the same table. He wanted knowledge without borders, a globe traced not in territory, but in thought. But empires move faster than ink dries. His armies surged forward, his generals jostled behind him, and the dream, the library, was left somewhere on the table between conversations and campaigns. Still there are whispers that he sent emissaries east, not just for tribute, but for texts, that he asked Persian scholars to bring ancient tablets, that his tent sometimes smelled not of wine or steel, but of parchment and oil. But if the collection began, it did so in fragments. Too many wars, too many fires, too many moments where knowledge was seen as threat, not treasure. There is one letter, disputed by scholars, in which Alexander, reportedly, instructed the priests of Babylon to send him all treatises on astronomy, agriculture, and healing. But no such texts were found in the aftermath. Some say they were lost, others say they were never sent, and some believe they were hidden deliberately. Because even then there were those who feared what might happen if knowledge left its cradle. What would a foreign king do with their sacred geometry? What would he twist or misinterpret? And more urgently, what might he forbid once he understood? Not all books burn in fire, some vanish in fear, and so the library remained mostly unwritten. A promise, a possibility, but not a place. When Alexander died, the vision of the library scattered like ash. His empire splintered. His generals fought over land, not thought. And yet, decades later, under Ptolemy, in that same coastal city, a great library was built. The Library of Alexandria. The dream reborn, though shaped by different hands. It would one day house hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Philosophers, physicians, playwrights. It would echo with languages the original founders never imagined. But Alexander would never walk its halls, would never place his own scroll on the shelf, would never see if the knowledge he sought had already disappeared. And even that library, that grandchild of his imagination, would one day fall to fire again and again, until only its legend remained. So what do we make of it? Was his library real? Was it ever begun? Or was it a ghost of intention? Something he longed for, in the quiet moments between cities and battles? Did he abandon it because he feared its power? Did he realize that once people learned, truly learned, they would not need kings? Or did the world simply move too fast and leave no space for a dream that needed time to take root? We don't know, but perhaps that's fitting, for libraries are not made only of books, they are made of questions. And this one, the first, the vanished, remains the most mysterious of all. Tonight, imagine it with me. A room lit by golden light, shelves humming with the weight of thought, languages curled beside one another like sleeping children. Imagine Alexander standing at its center, not as conqueror, but as student, just for a moment. Then let the image fade, softly, slowly, like smoke that never quite becomes fire. Close your eyes. Let the scrolls whisper back to you. Some knowledge survives not on paper, but in the quiet longing for what might have been. Persepolis did not fall in war, it fell in fire. Not the fire of battle, but of something older, something personal. When Alexander entered the heart of the Persian Empire, he did so not with celebration, but with stillness. The city had already surrendered. The people lined the roads with lowered heads. There was no siege, no last stand. But the silence of submission is often louder than resistance. Persepolis was not just a capital, it was a symbol, a city built not of brick and haste, but of pride, patience, and meaning. Stone columns stretched toward heaven. Reliefs carved into every wall told the story of an empire that once ruled the known world. Gold flickered in the crevices of stairwells. Even the air smelled of incense and inheritance, and Alexander walked through it like a guest, a conqueror in borrowed halls. They say the night began in wine, a celebration, a feast, music in foreign tones, cups refilled before they emptied. Among the guests was Thais, a companion, a courtesan, known not just for beauty, but for voice. She spoke of revenge, of what the Persians had done to Athens, to temples, to memory. She called for justice, for fire. She lifted her cup and said the city should burn. Some say Alexander laughed, some say he stood, some say he called for torches. The details blur, as they often do when truth meets smoke. But what remains is this: flames were set. And by morning, Persepolis, centre of an empire older than Alexander's imagination, was gone. Ash blew across its gardens, statues cracked open like eggshells. Roof beams, soaked in resin and time, collapsed with the weight of their own history. He stood among it afterward, they say, barefoot, silent, staring into the coals. Some say he wept, some say he muttered apologies to the gods. Others say he simply watched unmoved. What is certain is this: he never rebuilt it, he left the ruins behind. A city murdered, not martyred. Why? Was it drunken revenge, as the stories suggest? Was it performance, a message to the remaining Persian loyalists that their world was over? Or was it something deeper? Perhaps he looked upon Persepolis and felt its weight, not just its architecture, but its presence. It was a city that had survived empires, held kings, written laws. It made him feel small, and perhaps in a single impulsive act, he tried to erase that feeling. Not out of hate, but fear. For a man who believed himself divine, Persepolis reminded him of mortality, of time, of the fact that even greatness fades, even gods become dust. So he turned it to dust himself, before it could remind him again. But fire does not erase, it reveals. In the burned beams, in the blackened carvings, we read the story differently. We see a man unravelling, a boy who had reached the end of one story and found nothing waiting beyond it. He had conquered Persia, and yet the moment felt hollow, so he filled it with flame. Tonight, Persepolis lies quiet. Its stones are cool. The stars rise above it like a slow apology, and the fire that once danced through its halls now flickers only in memory. Some legacies are carved, others are burned, and the ash does not forget. Rest now. Let the silence of Persepolis speak for itself. Even ruined cities can whisper truths no fire can silence. His name was Hephaestion, not just a general, not just a friend. Something quieter, deeper, and perhaps more dangerous to name. They grew up together, trained together, studied philosophy and war in the same breath. When Alexander read of Achilles and Patroclus, Hephaestion was beside him, and many believe within him. Hephaestion knew Alexander before the crown, before the conquests, before the myths hardened around his skin. He saw the boy who paced at night with questions instead of answers. He heard the silences between the words. And in a world where everyone watched Alexander from a distance, Hephaestion stood close, close enough to correct him, close enough to be punished and forgiven. He was one of the few allowed into the private chambers. Not the ones with scrolls and maps, but the ones where fear lived, unspoken. They say Alexander trusted him with strategy, but more than that, he trusted him with uncertainty. When Hephaestion advised, Alexander listened, even when others disagreed, even when it endangered diplomacy or pride. This frightened the court, because a man like Alexander, too powerful, too restless, was already hard to predict. But a voice beside him, soft and steady, could sway the tide of empires. And so whispers grew, that Hephaestion had too much influence, that he knew too much, that he could break the king from within. And perhaps he did. In Ecbatana, after years of campaigns and exhaustion, Hephaestion fell ill. Some say it was fever, some say bad food, some say poison. Alexander arrived too late. By the time he entered the room, Hephaestion's breath was gone. Only the body remained, and the silence it left behind. The world recorded what happened next. Alexander did not speak. He did not eat. He did not bathe for days. He tore the doctor's reputation to shreds. He declared national mourning. He had the man's body burned like royalty, then ordered temples in his name. Not statues, temples. He sent a message to the oracle of Siwa, asking if Hephaestion could be honoured as a god. He, the man who once asked if he was divine, now asked for divinity to be granted to the one who once steadied his breath. And though the world moved on, Alexander never did. He became more ruthless, less patient, more prone to silence or sudden bursts of fury. His men said he was different now, that his eyes had gone further away, that he walked as if trying to find something that had slipped just beyond reach. But some said Hephaestion had left behind more than absence. Some said he had known something Alexander feared most, something real, beneath the legend. What that fear was, no one agreed. That he was losing control, that he was no god, that the dream was cracking. And some say just before his death, Hephaestion told someone else. A word, a truth, a confession whispered into the wrong ear. If that is true, the listener never repeated it. Or perhaps they did, and the message dissolved in fear. But Alexander's grief was not just personal, it became ritual. He began reshaping the world to fit his mourning, not with flowers, but with force. He punished cities that resisted. He demanded loyalty without question. He spoke of unity, but no longer believed it was possible. It was as if Hephaestion's death proved what Alexander had always feared, that no matter how many cities he built, no matter how many lands he crossed, he could not keep what mattered. Not even love, not even understanding. And if the one who knew him best could vanish, then perhaps so could the man he had once been. By the time Alexander reached Babylon, his steps were heavier, his smile rarer. He had lost the one person who made him mortal. The others feared him more, but they understood him less. Hephaestion had been a mirror. Now Alexander saw only his reflection in the gold of a cup or the burnish of a sword. Both distorted, both cold. Tonight we remember not the battles, but the bond that haunted a king. A bond that gave him strength, and then, in its vanishing, took it away. Rest now. Let the hush of Ecbatana settle around you. Some love stories are not written in letters. they're written in grief and in the silence that follows it. Close your eyes. The stars above them still shine. Paper can carry power. Ink, when placed carefully, can reveal more than armies. And in the years of his greatest reach, Alexander wrote often, not only decrees and commands, but letters. Private, personal, uncertain. He sent them to his satraps, the regional governors he installed across his empire, men loyal to him, in theory, but loyal more deeply to power, distance, and survival. These letters were not grand. They did not echo with proclamations. They murmured about shortages, delays, local resistance, about how some temples refused his coin, how old gods were not easily replaced, how some Macedonian soldiers were growing restless, confused by strange lands and stranger laws. And from Alexander, replies came, measured, then not, kind, then cold. His handwriting grew sharper over time, his tone less exploratory, more absolute. But behind the orders there was something else, doubt, not shouted, but penciled into the margins of certainty. What if the empire was too large? What if they misunderstood him? What if he was beginning to misunderstand himself? The letters offered glimpses of a man not sculpted in marble, but shaped by strain. And then, they were gone. A cache of them had survived for years, housed in Babylonian archives. They were catalogued briefly by early scribes, who noted their strange tone, and how they differed from official decrees. But when later historians returned, they were missing. Not burned, not torn, removed, as carefully as one might unthread a needle from silk, as if someone wanted to keep the fabric intact, but less truthful. And so, a question remains in the silence they left behind. Who took them? Some say it was Ptolemy, the general who took Egypt and history in one hand. He understood legacy. He knew that controlling memory was more valuable than controlling armies. Others say it was Cassander, cold-eyed, methodical, who would later erase Alexander's lineage piece by piece, who feared that too much humanity in a god might lead to rebellion. And some believe it was Alexander himself, that near the end he ordered their collection, not out of shame, but because he no longer recognized the voice within them. They were the voice of a man who questioned, who wondered, who needed reassurance, and that man, by Babylon, was gone. What replaces doubt is not always faith. Sometimes it is fear, and fear when powerful becomes erasure. The missing letters remind us of something we often forget, that what survives history is not what is true, but what is permitted. We hold monuments, coins, statues, but not breath, not hesitation, not the moment a man wonders if the road is leading him in circles. Imagine them, the scrolls tucked into wooden boxes, brittle now, unread, the slant of his hand at midnight, the ink smudged where a thumb rested too long, small things, human things, removed. Tonight we sit in that emptiness, not to mourn it, but to acknowledge it, to know that even the greatest figures, especially the greatest, leave behind silence that was once noise. The letters are not gone. They have simply changed form, into questions, into pauses in his story, into the faint echo of a man who, just once, may have whispered, "I don't know." Let that whisper settle into the room with you. Let it be enough. Sleep now, knowing even kings have doubts too soft for statues. History often ends in silence, but the silence around Alexander's death is not empty. It's swollen. Swollen with theories, contradictions, rumours and shadows. Because when a man who called himself divine dies young, the world leans in closer, not to mourn, but to ask how. By the time he returned to Babylon, Alexander was 32, still a young man, by age, but already older than myth. His body had carried him across deserts, jungles, mountaintops and riverbeds. He had faced arrows, fevers, frost and betrayal, but it was in the centre of the known world, not at the edge, that his breath began to leave him. The accounts differ. Some say he took ill after a night of heavy drinking. celebrating a coming campaign into Arabia, a chill in his limbs, pain in his belly, a voice that faded before the orders could. Others say the illness lasted 11 days, that he remained lucid, then not, that he whispered names into empty corners of the tent, that he asked more than once, "Have I gone too far?" And some say it was no illness at all, that the cup he raised that night, offered by a trusted hand or left unattended just long enough, was his undoing. Poison. Not the theatrical kind, not instant, but something slow, crafted to mimic fever, to exhaust, not explode. A scholar centuries later wrote of white hellebore, another guessed arsenic, hidden in sweet wine. But these are just names. The truth hides not in your medicine, but in motive. Who would want Alexander dead? The better question, who would not? His generals loved him, but they also feared the dream that kept growing, long past reason. He had just ordered preparations to conquer Arabia, then the Western Mediterranean, then perhaps more. The map had become hunger, and his men were weary. Their homes were far, their doubts closer than ever. He had no clear heir, no succession plan, only the ring he wore and the silence he left behind. In the days before his collapse, he refused food. He spoke to gods only he could see. He lost the strength to lift his arm, but not his gaze. Witnesses say his eyes still held the sky, even as his body failed him. When the end seemed near, his generals asked him, "To whom does the empire go?" And his answer, if he truly said it, was simple: "To the strongest." But those are words passed through too many mouths. What if he said nothing? What if, in the final moments, he could only blink, only breathe, only wish silently for something smaller than an empire, perhaps for time? We imagine kings dying with clarity, but most do not. Most simply slip. And Alexander, in the city he had made his axis, slipped. His body lay in state for days. They said it did not decay, that it was a sign of divinity, or perhaps of secret embalming. They encased him in gold. They planned to send him home to Macedonia, but the body never arrived. It was intercepted, taken to Egypt, placed in Alexandria, and then it vanished too. Another silence. So what killed him? Fever, poison, grief for Hephaestion, which had never truly left him? Or was it the weight of everything? Too many dreams, too many miles, too many names spoken too quickly. A kind of quiet collapse from the inside out, like a star burning too bright and finally giving in. We may never know. We are not meant to, because some deaths are not puzzles, they are mirrors. We look into them and see what we fear, what we need, what we hope never happens to us. Tonight, let the cup rest on the table, untouched. Let the fever pass through the air and move on. Let the questions hang above the bed like stars, close enough to feel, never close enough to name. And know this, Alexander died as he lived, followed by shadows, surrounded by silence, and watched by a world that still doesn't know how to say goodbye. Close your eyes now. The night is long but soft. And somewhere beneath forgotten stone, a gold casket waits for no one. History leaves marks, cities razed, letters faded, statues broken. But Alexander's tomb left none. Not a stone, not an inscription, not a direction home. He died in Babylon. That much is agreed. But the resting place of the man who once named the world after himself vanished. It was not supposed to be this way. Plans were drawn to carry his body back to Macedonia, to bury him beside his father in Aegae, where kings rested in gold-laced silence and dynasties became dust with dignity. But the body, wrapped in linen, sealed in honey, placed inside a golden sarcophagus so heavy it took days to lift, never made it home. On the journey, something changed. Ptolemy, his trusted general, intercepted the procession. Some say he used force, some say he simply redirected the route with a signature and a smile. The body was brought to Egypt, the land Alexander had loved, the land he once called the heart of his empire. Ptolemy buried him in Memphis first. Later, the body was moved to Alexandria, to a tomb said to rival even the pyramids. For a while, people came to see it. Julius Caesar, Augustus, they stood beside the glass coffin. They whispered, they wept, they touched the golden casing as if it pulsed with the last breath of greatness. And then, nothing. A flood, a war, a century lost in fire and forgetting. The tomb disappeared, buried under layers of silt, stone, and new cities built over old dreams. Today, scholars debate endlessly. Was it under the Great Square, beneath a Coptic church, near the ancient necropolis, or swallowed by the sea? Expeditions dig and pause, scans flicker and blur, and still, no tomb. Not even a fragment, not even a tile, just a silence too deliberate to be accidental. What if it was never meant to be found? What if Alexander, in those final days, burned by fever, hollowed by grief, faced with a world he could no longer hold, chose something quieter, to be erased, not as punishment, but as release? He had lived as a storm, as a myth in motion, as a figure larger than every map he touched. But myths burn bright, and they vanish fastest when the light is gone. A tomb is permanence, proof. It answers the question, where did he go? But Alexander's legacy had already outgrown his bones. Perhaps he knew a monument would make him smaller, that a shrine would freeze him in marble he couldn't control, that pilgrims would kneel, not in reverence, but in longing for the past. And Alexander, he had always walked forward. So maybe he chose disappearance, or maybe those who loved him most protected him from what death usually demands, a destination. Because tombs are not just for memory, they are also for ownership, and no one ever truly owned him. Let us imagine it now, a gold sarcophagus buried under layers of time, not lost, but sleeping. Or perhaps nothing remains. Perhaps the tomb was never built, the body unburied, returned to sand, ash, silence. Perhaps the point was never the resting place, but the journey away from it. What matters is not where he lies, but that we're still searching, that the absence draws us in like a fire that never burned, only smouldered. Some truths are louder when missing, and some men are most powerful in the space they no longer occupy. Tonight, rest in the not knowing. Let it comfort, not confuse. There are questions the world is not meant to answer, only carry. And Alexander's tomb, wherever, whatever, if ever, is one of them. Sleep now. The sand shifts slowly, and somewhere the dust knows what we never will. They say Alexander's hand was still warm when they took the ring, slipped from his finger, not with reverence, but with urgency. It passed from god to general in a single breath. The man who took it was Perdiccas, not the most loved, not the most feared, but the closest when the world fell quiet. He had been one of Alexander's trusted commanders, young, sharp, unwavering. He held the seal to the king's will, but the will had no heir, no instructions, just a ring and silence. It was not a coronation, it was a test. Perdiccas stood before the assembled generals, the diadochi, each one a predator cloaked in loyalty. He held up the ring and spoke carefully, saying Alexander had given it to him to hold the empire together until a proper successor could rule. But succession needs clarity. It needs lineage. Alexander left only rumours, an unborn child, a half-brother, said to be slow of mind and no decision. So the ring, that tiny circle of gold, became a storm. Not a symbol of unity, but a fracture point. The empire was too large to mourn. It needed dividing before it collapsed under its own silence. Perdiccas tried to hold it, tried to keep the pieces from scattering. He declared himself regent. He spoke of continuity. He marched through provinces with parchment and parade, speaking the name of a dead king like a prayer, hoping it would bind them still. But the empire was not made of stone. It was made of will. And without Alexander's, every border became a crack. The other generals circled. Ptolemy seized Egypt. Antigonus eyed Asia Minor. Cassander lingered in Greece, watching, waiting. What began as whispers turned to meetings. What began as disagreements turned to war. Perdiccas tried diplomacy. He offered compromise. He promised unity. But unity is a thread that breaks when pulled from too many ends. In one of history's quiet ironies, Perdiccas tried to invade Egypt, to reclaim what Alexander had once called sacred. But the Nile, indifferent to dreams, flooded at the wrong time. Boats were lost, men drowned. The army turned on him before he reached the city walls. He was murdered by his own officers, alone, unmourned. The ring, once a sign of divine power, passed again, into another hand, then another. Soon, no one could say who was rightful, only who was left. The empire splintered. Not slowly, but like glass dropped in a quiet room. Pieces flew, fiefdoms formed. Each general became a king in all but name. And Alexander's dream of one world, one law, one legend was reduced to maps redrawn too many times. Perdiccas is remembered not for victory, but for holding something too large to carry. He mistook a ring for a command. He mistook silence for permission. But Alexander's empire was always made of breath and belief. Once those left the room, no ring could hold it. Tonight, let us imagine that moment. A hand, pale and still. A ring lifted gently, not with reverence, but with a heart full of hope and fear. And the man who took it, not knowing it was the start of everything falling apart. Empires do not always fall in fire. Sometimes they fall in hesitation. Sleep now, listener. The gold still gleams somewhere, but its meaning has long since slipped through history's fingers. Alexander died without a map for what came after. No will, no name in ink, just the weight of a world held together by breath, and then no breath at all. So the generals came forward, not with reverence, but with rulers. They laid his empire across tables like a carcass, and they carved it. Not carefully, not fairly, just quickly, as if the body of his dream would rot if not divided in haste. Ptolemy took Egypt, with its soft floodplains and hard gods. He called himself protector first, then king. He kept Alexander's body, built a library, and rewrote memory with quiet brilliance. Seleucus took Babylon, then Syria, Persia, and more. His domain spanned vast distances, but it was brittle, too stretched to hear its own heart. Lysimachus claimed Thrace and parts of Asia Minor. Cassander remained in Macedonia, eyes always on the past, spending more time erasing Alexander's family than building anything new. Antigonus tried to take it all. For a time he nearly did. They called themselves satraps, regents, stewards, but soon they were kings. The unity Alexander had fought for, bled for, believed in, fractured like cracked porcelain, and still none of them held the centre. They had the land, the titles, the temples, but not the pulse, for what Alexander had made was not an empire of borders. It was an empire of momentum, and momentum dies in division. The Diadochi, the successors, were never heirs. They were shadows, mimics, each one shaping his memory to justify their peace. One said Alexander had named him the rightful ruler. Another produced a forged will. Another built statues in his honour, while silencing anyone who spoke of his flaws. But none of them could recreate the strange gravity of the man himself. So they fought, not for his legacy, but for the illusion of it. Wars broke out across the former empire. Brothers turned on brothers, alliances frayed like old rope. Cities burned in his name, though he was not there to watch them fall. It is said that a single commander's soldier, marching through a ruined town, asked, "Why are we still fighting if the king is dead?" No one answered, because the truth was too fragile. The dream had become a story passed between swords. They held the weapons, they inherited the walls, but not the wonder, not the sense that something new was possible. That part, the heart of Alexander's world, was the first to vanish. The rest simply followed. So tonight, we picture the table. The men leaning over it, tired and ambitious, splitting up mountains, rivers, gods, and languages as if they could fit in columns and ink. But dreams don't divide cleanly, they splinter, and the sound of that splintering echoes still. Close your eyes now. Let the map fade. Some legacies are not inherited. They are lost the moment too many hands try to hold them. Babylon was older than memory. By the time Alexander entered its gates, the city had watched empires rise and fall like breath. It was a city of stars and shadows, of brick that hummed with time, of ziggurats that reached for the gods, not out of pride, but out of pact. Here, language began in clay, pressed with reeds, baked in fire, cuneiform, the oldest breath ever trapped in stone. The priests of Babylon recorded everything: eclipses, crop patterns, births of twins, the dreams of kings. They believed the gods whispered through patterns, and if you watched long enough, the world spoke back. So when Alexander entered the city, not as conqueror, but as guest, they did what they had always done. They wrote. They described him in signs, not as a name, but as an event. They noted thunder in clear skies, a flame that moved backward against the wind, birds falling dead with no wounds, a dog giving birth to a snake. These were not omens to be ignored. They were warnings, not of war, but of imbalance. For Babylon was not just walls and statues, it was balance, kept sacred through ritual and rhythm. And Alexander, with his foreign gods, his divine claims, his questions that cut too deep, was a crack in the ritual. He asked to enter the Esagila, the temple of Marduk, the city's oldest god. He wanted to offer sacrifice, not as a supplicant, but as one of them. Some priests refused, some complied, all recorded. They wrote of a king who was curious in the wrong ways, who asked why certain prayers were still chanted, who touched a statue not meant to be touched, who lingered too long at the ziggurat's edge, staring not up, but down. They feared him, not because of his armies, but because he disrupted the silence in which their gods spoke, and so they turned to the stars. Babylonian astrologer priests, Baru, read omens from liver models, from the flight of birds, from the movement of Jupiter. The tablets from this period speak of disturbances, heavenly misalignments, patterns broken. Some mention a foreign king whose voice bends the sky. Another notes, the king inquires too deeply. The gods turn their faces. Were these metaphors, or veiled reports? Were the gods turning away, or were the priests preparing to? Alexander's health began to falter, not long after his arrival in Babylon. The omens intensified. Fires burned backward. Wells ran dry, then refilled without rain. Some modern scholars dismissed these as legend, fragments of myth told backward through time. But others believed the priests were warning each other, not of God, but of a reckoning. A man who stepped too far into what should remain sacred. A king who believed divinity could be learned rather than earned. And perhaps they decided he would not leave the city. Did they poison him? We do not know. But the scrolls do not mourn. They observe. The moment of his death is not written as tragedy, but as balance restored. The moon returned to its right shape. The river flowed west again. The king no longer questioned. These are not the words of grief. They are the words of closing a circle. And when his body was removed, taken from Babylon to parts unknown, the priests did not follow. They simply picked up their reeds and began writing again. About the crops, about the stars, about a different kind of silence. So what are we to make of this? Was it warning? Was it resistance written in soft clay? Or was it myth layered onto a man already half a god in the eyes of history? Perhaps it is all three. Alexander arrived in Babylon as a question, and left as an answer no one could quite agree on. The scrolls remain, tucked in museum drawers, unread or half-translated, waiting for someone to feel not just the meaning, but the pause between lines. Because sometimes the quietest lines in history are the ones that mattered most. Tonight, let us sit with those tablets, not to solve the riddle, but to hear the whisper beneath it. Was it warning? Was it lie? Or was it simply truth, spoken too softly for a king to hear? Close your eyes now. The stars above Babylon still shift, and somewhere in clay, the past remembers better than we do. A crown is loud, it changes the shape of a room. People speak differently when power is listening. Alexander knew this. He had seen lips tremble before they moved, had watched soldiers nod even when they disagreed. He had heard too many truths softened by fear. So, some say, he took the crown off. Not literally, not in daylight, but at night. When the cities he had conquered fell into sleep, and the torches dimmed, he would wrap himself in wool, darken his skin with ash or dust and walk, alone, or with one trusted guard, trailing just far enough behind. In Babylon, in Susa, in the alleys of newly founded Alexandrius, he would pass as a trader, a messenger, a farmer's son, unseen, unremarkable, and he would listen to merchants griping about taxes, to drunk soldiers mumbling about orders, to women drawing water who cursed the pace of war, to boys reenacting battles with carved sticks, some playing the Greeks, some not. He listened to how his name was spoken, or not spoken at all, and what he heard was not always praise. He heard that he was distant, that his laws favoured strangers, that temples had been emptied for his monuments, that gods were being pushed aside for gold. He heard love too, but love bent by fear or wrapped in confusion. The people, many said, did not know if he was a hero or a ghost. He returned from these walks silent, sometimes shaken. Once, they say, he spent a night sitting outside his own palace, watching the guards from the shadows, just watching, as if trying to remember what it meant to be unseen. Truth sounds different without gold around it. He had learned that too. He once told a court scribe, "If I want to hear the truth, I must stop being Alexander." The scribe smiled, but Alexander didn't. Perhaps that is why he kept walking, through streets still learning how to pronounce his name, through provinces that hadn't decided whether to obey or endure. He did not always interfere. He did not always punish what he heard. He was not searching for traitors. He was searching for clarity. Because even gods, especially gods, become disoriented in temples built too quickly. But there's a cost to such walks. One cannot hear the people and remain untouched. Some say he began to change, to doubt his counsel more, to delay decisions, to redraw plans, not to expand, but to hold. He began speaking of rest, of teaching, of philosophy. He began speaking again like a student, and perhaps that frightened him most, because Alexander had built a world that could only be carried by momentum. A pause was dangerous, a question could unravel it. So he resumed the marches, resumed the glory. But the walks, they did not stop. They simply went deeper. Later, quieter. One report, written long after his death, claims a woman once recognized him. His voice too clear, his questions too sharp. She bowed in the dark, but he touched her shoulder and said, "Please, speak to me as if I mattered less." There is no record of her reply. But what lingers in this story, true or not, is the desire behind it. A man who ruled the known world, still uncertain of how he was seen, or whether he wanted to be seen at all. Tonight, let us walk with him, through silent streets, through markets half-packed, past homes still glowing with candlelight. Let us hear the murmurs that never made it into history, and let us imagine a king, not conquering, not commanding, just listening. Because sometimes the quietest moments reveal the loudest truths. Close your eyes. The gold is gone, the crown is sleeping, only the footsteps remain. History favours the ones who write it, and Alexander, with his scribes and sculptors, with his coin makers and commanders, ensured his victories echoed louder than his refusals. But beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers of northern India, there was a queen whose name rarely crossed his lips, and whose defiance never made it into marble. Her name was Durdara. She ruled a kingdom untouched by Greek myths, untouched by the language of conquest. Her people worshipped different gods, read different stars, and bowed to no throne outside their soil. When Alexander's messengers arrived, not with swords, but with silks, gold, and polite threat, they came bearing gifts, inscribed bowls, ivory boxes, a mirror framed in lion teeth. But Durdara did not thank them. She asked one question. "Do you bring these because you admire us, or because you expect us to kneel?" the messengers stammered. They had no answer prepared, so she gave one for them. She sent the gifts back, each item wrapped carefully, each silk folded as it came, not with disrespect but with precision, so there would be no mistake. Her refusal was not war, it was sovereignty. Alexander, upon hearing of this, did not rage, but he did not forget. He ordered scouts to assess the terrain. He asked questions about her army. He looked eastward, again, but monsoons made the roads impassable. His men were tired. His dream of reaching the edge of the world was beginning to blur. He never made it to her gates. Still, Durdara prepared. She reinforced the walls, she gathered her advisors, she spoke to her people not of fear, but of dignity. In a rare preserved tablet, now nearly erased by time, a scribe recorded her words. "A gift offered with a map behind it is not a gift, it is a warning carved in silk." Alexander did not retaliate, perhaps because he couldn't, perhaps because he chose not to, perhaps because something in her refusal unnerved him more than resistance ever could. She had not fought him, she had not flattered him, she had simply said no, and no, from someone with nothing to lose, is harder to silence than any sword. After his death, when the historians began polishing the myth, her name was absent. Her country was folded into vague references, her people mentioned only as obstacles, never voices, and yet one account remained. A statue uncovered centuries later, not of Alexander, but of a woman, seated, arms crossed, face calm. At the base, a weathered inscription. She did not bow. Scholars debate its meaning. They wonder if it is Durdara at all, but the legend has taken root, softly, stubbornly. And sometimes legend, even unproven, is enough to echo. Because every empire, no matter how vast, passes over stories it cannot control. And this was one of them. Tonight, let us imagine her, not as statue, but as woman, walking the corridors of her palace barefoot, not in fear of invasion, but in quiet pride, knowing her people were still her own, knowing her voice had not been folded into tribute. She may not have written her refusal on parchment, but she carved it into the space he never entered. And that silence still speaks. Close your eyes. The gifts are untouched, the gates are closed, and in the hush beyond the empire, a queen still watches. Toward the end, Alexander stopped asking. He began declaring, not as a king, as something else, something higher. He no longer dined with his generals as equals. He received them from a throne, spoke less, watched more. And when he did speak, his words curved with divine certainty. He had once sought to unify East and West, Greece and Persia. Now he sought to unify heaven and earth, with himself in the middle. He demanded proskynesis, the Persian custom of bowing, touching forehead to ground, a gesture once reserved for gods. To many of his men, it was sacrilege. They had fought beside him, bled beside him, watched him fall from horses, laugh in rivers, grieve at Hephaestion's side. He had once been human, larger than life, yes, but within it. Now he was ascending, and they could no longer follow. The satraps, the governors he'd placed across his stitched-together empire, began to murmur. At first it was doubt, then frustration, then fear. He was marrying daughters of foreign kings, naming children born of bloodlines unfamiliar to Macedonia, replacing loyalty with lineage, and still he demanded worship. At banquets, wine blurred lines. They raised their cups to his name, to his glory, to his eternal reign. But not every hand trembled with devotion. Some trembled with calculation. They had followed him across the world, but the world had changed, and so had he. He spoke less of justice, more of destiny. He punished dissent with cold finality. Parmenion, Clytus, men once trusted, now gone. One had questioned his lineage, another his judgment. Both were silenced. The message was clear. He was no longer to be challenged, only believed. But belief given in fear rots quickly. So the satraps began planning like men, while he lived like myth. They wrote letters in code, met behind drapes beneath the guise of religious rites. They passed information, not with treasonous words, but with shared silences. Not all of them wanted him dead. Some only wanted limits, boundaries, to put the crown back on his head, not above it. But others had begun to think of a world beyond him. A world that didn't require endless war, didn't orbit one man's hunger. And in that imagining, a seed was planted. They toasted him still. They raised goblets with the rest, but some drank to the end before it arrived. When he fell ill in Babylon, the air in the royal court shifted. Some rushed to his side, others watched the sky, and a few waited to see if fate would do what they could not. And when the fever deepened, when his voice fell into a whisper, they did not intervene. They did not pray. They simply let it happen. There was no single assassin, no blade beneath a robe, no confession in ink. Only the quiet choices of men who once believed, and now believed in something else. Alexander's death was a slow unravelling, but the decision to let it happen may have been quick. Because fear does not need blood, only opportunity. And in the final days, when his eyes searched for answers and found only shadows, he may have realised. Not all the toast had been sincere. Some were to the man, some to the myth, and some to the silence that would follow. Tonight, let us sit with that silence, not to judge, but to understand. Even gods, when surrounded by men, must face the consequences of forgetting what it means to be mortal. Sleep now. The wine has gone still. The room is empty, and the truth, whatever it was, has gone with them. There are deaths that shake the world, and then there are deaths so large, no one dares admit them. When Alexander died, his generals did not announce it, not at first. The tent where he lay, heavy with incense and shadow, remained guarded but silent. No mourning drums, no public weeping, no declaration. Because to say he was gone was to admit the centre had vanished, and without a centre, the world they'd built could tilt and collapse. So they waited. They issued orders in his name. They stamped his seal. They marched his army forward as if he were only sleeping. In distant satrapies, governors bowed to a king already breathless. Messengers ran through dust-choked roads, with proclamations signed by a ghost. Even his closest companions dared not speak of succession. To name a successor was to name an ending, and no one wanted to own that. So the empire, at least for a little while, pretended. Not out of loyalty, not even out of fear, but out of necessity. Alexander had not just ruled them, he had defined them. To say he was dead was to say the dream was too, and they weren't ready to wake up. In the camps, soldiers sharpened weapons, drilled, ate in silence, but something hung in the air, a tension too shapeless to speak. Rumours fluttered at the edges of their tents, that he had ascended, that he had disappeared into the desert to speak with the gods, that he would return a stronger, stranger, more than human. Some believed it, some needed to, because if he was truly gone, what had they all been marching for? In Babylon, the scribes kept writing, each scroll dated in the year of the reign of Alexander. No corrections, no hesitation, because the myth still breathed, and in some ways it always had. Alexander had long existed in a space between man and myth, between breath and bronze, between crown and constellation. He became what people needed, a god to some, a curse to others, a story to everyone. And for a time, that story continued without interruption. But myths cannot sign treaties. They cannot feed armies. They cannot choose heirs. The silence began to fray. A general asked, "Who commands the treasury?" A commander whispered, "To whom do I bow?" The questions, once buried, rose like smoke. And so, after weeks, maybe months, the truth was spoken, carefully, quietly, to the right ears. Alexander was dead. The announcement, when it came, was not made to the people. It was made to power, and that power splintered. But even then, the myth did not die. Coins were still minted with his face. Cities still bore his name. Children were still named after him. In Egypt, he was worshipped as a god. In India, he became a shadow in local legends. In Rome, centuries later, Caesar wept when he saw a statue of Alexander, not because he loved him, but because he had not matched him. He lived longer in imagination than he ever did in flesh. And perhaps he still does, not as ruler, but as a reminder of ambition without apology, of a man who redrew maps and then walked off the edge of them. The empire that bore his weight could not last. It broke, split, fractured into kingdoms ruled by men who had once followed and then forgot. But the echo remained, and in that echo he lived. Tonight we sit in that strange space, between myth and memory, between silence and what follows. Because sometimes what lives longer than a man is not his empire, but the idea that he was ever more than one. Close your eyes. The throne is empty, but still warm. And outside the walls, the world is still listening. Even legends leave behind the soft weight of inheritance. Alexander, conqueror, dreamer, divine in the eyes of some, was also a father. But fatherhood in his world was not gentle, it was strategic. And his children, born into Echo and Empire, were not heirs. They were symbols, pieces on a board already crumbling. He had at least one son with Roxana, the Bactrian princess he had taken as wife, not just for love, but to weave unity into blood. Their child was born after his death. Alexander IV, named for a man he would never meet, born into silence, swaddled not in warmth, but in expectation, too young to speak, too young to rule, too dangerous to ignore, and so he was hidden, protected, or perhaps isolated. Roxana clutched him like a thread between worlds. Not just her son, but her survival. But children in the aftermath of empire are often less protected than they appear. Another child existed too, Heracles, born of Barcina, a Persian noblewoman. A quieter name, a quieter child, but with blood that could not be ignored. 2 boys, 2 bloodlines, and a dozen men with more power than either. The generals, Alexander's successors, spoke of loyalty, but moved like predators circling a fire. No one wanted the child to rule, not truly. A child meant regency. Regency meant uncertainty, and uncertainty in the shadow of an empire already splitting was fatal, so the children were passed from hand to hand, tucked away in citadels, paraded when useful, silenced when not. Alexander IV grew into a quiet boy, eyes too large, words too careful. He was never crowned, he was never taught to lead. He was raised in the echo of a man whose name still cracked the air. But legacy does not always flow clean in the veins. It pools, it curdles, it stains. The world did not want another Alexander. It wanted closure. And so, one by one, his children disappeared. Heracles, once considered a possible unifier, was killed under Cassander's orders. Quietly, no trial, no burial recorded. Alexander IV and his mother fared little better, kept under protection, then slowly erased. They were poisoned, not all at once, but over time, with food, with isolation, with decisions made behind doors no child could open. When the news finally surfaced, it was not met with mourning. It was met with relief. The last flickers of Alexander's line had gone out, and the torch he once carried, that bright, defiant flame, was left on the ground. No hand to lift it, no breath to keep it alive, so the generals carried on, without heirs, without questions. They built statues of him, minted coins with his face, named their sons after him, but they made sure none of his own blood would ever return. Because true legacy is dangerous. It holds the power to remind, to reclaim, to restart. And those who had taken the pieces of his world wanted only to keep them, not to share them. Tonight, let us remember the children, not as kings or saviors, but as small flickering candles kept too far from the wind. They were born into greatness, but not into safety. And their story, not told in books but in what was done to keep them from writing their own, remains a quiet, aching truth. Close your eyes. Some bloodlines end not in war, but in whispers, and the softest tragedies are the ones we barely speak. Alexander did not simply want to rule the world, he wanted to reflect it, to shape it in his own image, but also to see himself in its shapes. He imagined a world without division, East and West no longer at odds, but married in stone, in law, in lineage, a world where language was shared, where gods conversed across temples, where no river marked a border, only a beginning. It was not just conquest, it was vision. And vision, when untested, can shimmer like a mirror. So he built one, not of glass, but of cities, of marriages between cultures, of laws that borrowed from Greece, Persia, India, of rituals sewn together from different altars. 1,000 details, all reaching toward a single idea. We are not so different. He married Roxana, then Statira, daughter of Darius. He encouraged his officers to marry Persian women. He brought satraps from every background into his court. He wore Persian robes, took their titles, learned their customs. To his admirers, it was genius. To his men, it was betrayal. They had marched behind a Macedonian king. Now they followed a stranger, draped in silks that didn't belong to them, speaking in voices they didn't understand. Unity in practice meant discomfort, sacrifice, listening when it was easier to command. And mirrors, true mirrors, don't just show our dreams, they show our contradictions. The more Alexander tried to blend the world, the more he revealed its fractures. A Persian priest refused to enter his court. A Greek poet wrote verses mocking his foreign manners. Soldiers muttered behind his back, asked if their king had been replaced by a costume. Even his inner circle began to blur. What was policy and what was performance? Was he still building an empire or staging one? The mirror began to warp. At a mass wedding ceremony in Susa, he married dozens of his generals to Persian noblewomen. A gesture of unity, a theatre of peace. But most of the marriages didn't last. Some were annulled before a year passed. Others were simply ignored. Because you cannot fuse the world by decree. You cannot command the heart to agree with the crown. And still, he tried. He tried with paradas and proclamations, with architecture and coinage, with stories whispered into scrolls before they were truth. But mirrors don't bend for our hopes. They crack when we press too hard. And Alexander, always pressing further, always chasing the next horizon, pressed beyond what reflection could bear. By the time he reached India, his army was splintering. They no longer saw the dream. They saw a man building a world that didn't include them. And perhaps he didn't realize it, because when you live inside a mirror, you begin to see only yourself. In the final months, he spoke often of unity, but rarely of cost. He imagined a single language, a single law, a single line of descent. But the world did not want to be made of one thing. It wanted to be many. His mirror, meant to reflect everyone, began to reflect only him. And when it cracked, the pieces scattered. Each general picked up a shard. Each kingdom took a version. Each historian wrote what they wanted to believe. And we, 2,000 years later, are left with those shards, sharp, shimmering, inconsistent. In one, he is a philosopher king. In another, a brutal conqueror. In another, a god. In another, a lost boy in armor, searching for meaning on every shore. Perhaps they are all true, or perhaps none are, because when a mirror breaks, truth breaks with it. Alexander wanted to show the world itself. He held it up with conviction. But no mirror can carry that weight, especially not when the face behind it is still becoming. Tonight, Let us imagine that mirror again, polished, trembling, still unbroken, a world reflected in 1,000 languages, 1,000 beliefs, 1,000 truths, and a man, just one man, standing at its centre, hoping it will hold. Not because he needed control, but because he needed meaning. That was the heart of it, perhaps. He didn't want to own the world, he wanted to make sense of it. And in that effort, he became both builder and breaker. Let us not blame him. Let us not worship him. Let us simply look into the shards, into the questions, into the quiet spaces where the reflection didn't reach. And rest there, because even cracked mirrors can still catch the light. Close your eyes. You are not holding history. You are holding pieces of longing. Empires often pretend to be eternal. They raise monuments, they carve laws into stone, they measure time from the reigns of kings, as if permanence were proof of purpose. But some empires, the truest ones, are not written to last. They are sketched quickly, with breath held tight, drawn with a finger in soft sand meant to be seen only once, and only by those who know what to look for. Alexander's empire may have been one of these. It stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the banks of the Indus, a sweep of territory wider than any ruler before him, but its foundations were not stone. They were motion, they were fire, they were his will. And when his will left the world, the shape of what he had drawn began to blur, not because it failed, but because it had always been fragile. He conquered swiftly, too swiftly for laws to take root, too swiftly for stories to settle. He built cities faster than he could name governors. He appointed satraps he barely knew. He blended gods, tongues and customs with poetry. But little pause. His dream was vast, but dreams don't always survive the waking. The people he ruled, Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, Bactrians, Scythians, did not become one people. They became one moment, a moment of contact, of curiosity, of upheaval, and then they became themselves again. Alexander never ruled a united world. He ruled a world in conversation with itself, briefly, brightly. Then, like all conversations left unfinished, it faded. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps his empire was not meant to endure. Perhaps he did not want to be remembered for what he held, but for what he touched. Like a comet that doesn't linger, just reshapes the sky, then disappears. We often measure success by longevity, but some marks are deepest when they don't try to stay. Alexander's legacy lives in more than geography. It lives in stories half told, in cities that forgot his name but kept his street plan, in languages that borrowed from his soldiers, in coins, in dreams, in fragments. Even now, his name is whispered in places he never reached. But not because he built an empire that stood, because he drew something that moved. And movement, even when erased, leaves behind a trace. Imagine it now, a desert at dusk, the wind still. A boy kneels, presses one finger into sand, and draws a line from one horizon to another. It won't last the night, the wind will come, the stars will shift, but for a moment, it is beautiful. And everyone who sees it remembers something they can't explain. That was Alexander. Not the marble, not the crown, not the sword, but the line in the dust that reminded the world it could change. Close your eyes now. Let the sand settle. Let the dream fade. Not everything that vanishes is lost. Statues are loud. They stand with arms outstretched, swords drawn, faces lifted towards some eternal horizon. They do not ask, they declare. And the statues of Alexander, cast in bronze, carved in marble, etched into coin, declare greatness, victory, conquest made eternal. He rides the immortal horse. He wears the lion's head. He points toward the east, always toward the east. But beneath each pedestal, beneath the weight of stone and story, there's something quieter, something buried, something not made to be seen, but felt, a whisper. Because the louder a monument shouts, the more likely it's covering a silence too sharp to speak. Alexander's silence was not just about death, it was about doubt, and statues, no matter how finely made, cannot answer doubt. They only distract from it. He wanted to be remembered, so he made himself difficult to forget. But memory is not the same as understanding, and beneath the marble, we don't find certainty, we find questions. Did he believe in the unity he preached, or was it a tool for control? Did he see himself as divine, or did he need others to see it so he could survive the weight of what he had done? Was his vision of one world, one people, one dream real? Or was it a kind of grief for something he knew he could never hold? We look up at his statues and see resolve, but beneath them, in the silence between tours and textbooks, there's regret. Not from the stone, from the story. A story that knows it left too much out. A story that tightens, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. And maybe that's the warning. That greatness forged too quickly leaves cracks. That legacy built without rest starts to wobble the moment breath runs out. And maybe that even gods should be careful what they ask of silence, because silence remembers. It stores what doesn't make it into speeches. It carries the names of the forgotten, the cities that failed, the voices ignored, the questions buried. And every so often, when the night is still enough, that silence rises. Not to destroy the statue, but to stand beside it. To remind us that nothing is finished, not even the past. There's a marble Alexander in Istanbul, eyes calm, jaw set. There's another in Paris, fist clenched over a broken spear. There are coins in museums, frescoes in ruins, faces carved and recarved until no one remembers the first version. But look past the surface. Look where the light doesn't reach, in the cracks, in the base. There's something beneath them all. Not defeat, not guilt, just a hush, a kind of knowing. That empire is not made of stone, it's made of silence, and how long we're willing to listen. Tonight, close your eyes. Not to forget, but to hear more clearly. The marble is still cold, the statue still stands. But underneath it, something waits, a question, a pause, a whisper that may never become words, but one we carry anyway. Sleep now. Statues stand, but silence walks beside you, and tonight it walks slow. Some stories refuse to settle. They slip through timelines, avoid conclusions, leave the final page unwritten. You try to hold them, but they shift. You think you've reached the ending, and then it glances back at you, with a smile that says, "Not yet." Alexander's story is one of these. Too wide, too fast, too alive. It doesn't end with his death, or with the fall of his generals, or with the disappearance of his tomb. It just continues, in fragments, a coin unearthed in a distant field, a boy in a village named Iskandar, a legend about a gate that keeps out monsters, built by a golden-haired king who came from the west and vanished into sky. His life became a skeleton. Key slipped into every culture, every language, adapted, rewritten, believed. He was the hero, he was the villain, he was a seeker of wisdom, he was the wrath of the gods, he was divine, he was damned, he was everything but finished. Even history, with all its confidence why chokes on his name. Not because we lack facts, but because facts don't fit. They contradict, overlap, undo each other. He fought for unity, but brought war. He built cities, but left them empty. He claimed to honour cultures, but demanded his name rise above theirs. And yet, he is remembered. Not just remembered, returned to. Over and over. He appears in medieval Persian poems, in Islamic tradition as Dul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, in Christian fables, in Buddhist stories, everywhere a different shape, but always the same ache behind the eyes, a man who reached too far and left behind a trail too tangled to follow. Why do we return to him? Maybe because he did what few dared. He imagined a world bigger than the one he was born into, and maybe because he failed. Not in conquest, but in completion, and that failure, that crack in the mirror, makes him ours. Not a god, not marble, but human, exhausted, haunted by a map that wouldn't stop unfolding. History tries to digest him, tries to file him into categories: tyrant, genius, hero, monster, but each word leaves something out. And so his story remains where it began, in motion. A suggestion, not a certainty. A man who tried to make the world one thing and left it more divided. A man who broke what he loved and still believed it could be beautiful. That paradox, that wound, is what survives. Tonight, you don't need to understand him. No one ever has. You only need to sit beside the story, to hold the edge of it, to know that some truths don't land. They float, like ash, like myth, like a crown set gently down in a room no longer listening. Close your eyes, let it drift, let it breathe. Some stories are not told to be resolved, but to remind us that not everything must be. He dreamed without limits, not just of empires and walls, but of dissolving them. Of one world, not stitched together, but flowing. Where names changed, but purpose didn't. Where languages blended, and gods sat at the same table. Alexander wanted to erase the lines, the ones on maps, the ones between people, the ones that told you who to trust and who to conquer. He dreamed of a world without them, a world where difference didn't require dominance, where east and west weren't enemies, they were directions on the same wind. He believed it could happen, not just in thought, but in motion. Every step he took was a sentence in that dream. Every city built, every coin minted, every oath sworn in 2 languages. He called it unity, others called it arrogance, but to him it was clarity. And yet, the world did not follow. His men grew restless. They wanted to return to places with familiar prayers, familiar food, familiar fears. His new subjects watched him with careful eyes. Some bowed out of respect, some out of calculation. Many bowed only because they had no other choice. Unity, in practice, meant discomfort. It meant learning what had once been safe to ignore. It meant letting go of the centre and trusting in the edges. And most were not ready for that. Or maybe they never wanted it at all. Maybe the world didn't want to be one. Maybe the borders weren't just on maps, they were in hearts, in memory, in inheritance, and no king, no matter how brilliant, can conquer what people don't want to share. His dream began to shake. Soldiers muttered. Satraps stalled. Allies grew quiet. At the riverbank in India, his men refused to go farther. They begged, they wept. They said they had followed him to the edge of the world and could go no further. Alexander turned from them, staring into the jungle. He stayed there a long time, and when he returned, he didn't speak of disappointment. He just said, "We will go back," but something had broken. Not just in the plan, in the dream itself. It had woken too soon, and like any dream yanked from sleep, it left him blinking. He returned west with steps that felt heavier. The air was different, the silence longer. He still ruled, still commanded, still envisioned, but a part of him, the boy who once believed stories could become maps, had gone quiet. Some say he began to doubt, that he spoke to himself at night, that he redrew the same borders over and over, but never liked how they looked. And when death came, sudden and shapeless, it felt not like a finale, but an interruption. The dream ended with him. Not because it was wrong, but because it needed more time, more patience, more people willing to look past what they were told was theirs. But the world wasn't ready, or maybe, just maybe, it never will be. Because dreams like his don't belong to any one age. They flicker, they rise, they fall asleep again, and in quiet corners of history, they stir, waiting for someone else to ask, what if we erased the lines? Tonight, we sit beside that dream, not to mourn it, not to revive it, but to remember that it existed. A dream too large for one man, too early for one world, but real. Real enough that we still speak of it and wonder. Close your eyes, let the lines fade, let the world, just for a moment, be borderless again. Some dreams don't die, they simply wait. Time softens everything, Marble crumbles, scrolls turn to dust. Even names once shouted through corridors of power become whispers lost in translation. But some questions they don't erode, they linger. And Alexander leaves us with one. Who was he really? Was he a tyrant? He conquered cities that never attacked him. He burned Persepolis. He executed those who spoke too freely. He demanded worship. Was he a prophet? He dreamed of unity before the world could imagine it. He saw past race, past language, past allegiance. He tried to build bridges instead of walls. He believed in something bigger than himself, even if he confused it with himself. Or was he just a boy, haunted by his mother's gods, chasing the ghosts of Homer's heroes, terrified of being ordinary? A boy with too much ambition and no pause button. A boy who wanted to matter, to carve his name into the world before the world could forget him. The truth, if it ever existed, has scattered. Shards in libraries, silences in ruins, echoes in places he never reached, but still claimed in name. Because that's what myth does. It travels farther than men ever can. And so we're left not with answers, but with the echo. The echo that asks, why did he do it? Why conquer so much so fast? Why try to merge the world into one body, one voice, one law? Why chase the edge of every map as if it would reveal a secret only he could see? And perhaps, beneath all those whys is a smaller one? Was it worth it? The cities crumbled, the unity unravelled, the bloodlines ended. And yet, his name still glows. On coins, on street signs, in stories told far from Macedonia, to children who've never held a sword but know the weight of longing. Maybe that's why we can't let him go, because Alexander wasn't just a man. He was a mirror held up to the human condition, to our thirst, our wonder, our contradiction. He built, he destroyed, he united, he divided. He saw the world more clearly than most, and then blurred it in his own reflection. He was not one thing, he was all of them. And that's what history cannot digest. That the boy, the king, the dreamer, and the destroyer were all the same heartbeat. We still ask, because we need to, not to define him, but to understand ourselves. For every empire since has felt his shadow, every leader who sought too much, every idea too big to last, every vision that collapsed under its own weight. Somewhere, his whisper lingers, not in instruction, not in warning, but in wonder. Could we ever build something that holds? Tonight, let the question settle beside you. Let it speak softly, not for answers, but for stillness. Alexander does not need to rise again. He never truly left. He is the echo that asks why, and the silence that follows when no one is sure. Close your eyes, let the stars shift, let the question carry you to sleep.